John had been working as a USPS driver for several years now, and every day seemed to follow the same routine. The familiar hum of his truck's engine, the constant flow of packages to be delivered, and the friendly faces of the neighbors he passed on his route had become second nature to him. It was a quiet morning, with the sun rising slowly over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sleepy neighborhood. As he navigated the winding streets of the suburban area, John felt a sense of calm wash over him. Another day, another set of deliveries. He'd been up early, ready to start his shift, as the early hours were the best time for him to get through his route with minimal distractions. John always believed in doing his job well, and that meant sticking to the schedule as closely as possible. The weather was perfect that day, bright and clear, with no signs of rain to slow him down. As he drove, he waved to familiar faces of people getting their morning coffee or walking their dogs, greeting them with a friendly smile. They waved back, many of them knowing him by name. John loved his job. He had grown to know the people he delivered to, from the elderly couple who lived at the corner house to the busy parents who always seemed to be in a hurry. It made the job feel more personal. He didn't mind the early hours or the long drives. They were a part of his daily routine, and in a way, he had come to appreciate the simplicity of it all. Each stop was a moment of connection, however brief, with the people in the neighborhood. He liked the idea that his job was helping to keep the community together, even if he never stayed long enough to see the full picture. As he approached the first house of the day, he noticed a package sitting on the porch. It was neatly placed, just as it should be, but something about it seemed off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it at first, but a small feeling of unease settled over him. Perhaps it was the way the package was positioned, or maybe it was the fact that it looked like it had been waiting for a while. Normally, when he delivered a package, he would ring the doorbell or leave a note if no one was home, but there was no note or indication of whether someone had already received it. The porch was silent and still, with no movement inside. John glanced at his watch. It was still early, so maybe the homeowners hadn't come out yet. But then he noticed something strange. A small handwritten note was attached to the side of the package. It wasn't the usual delivery confirmation or a simple thank you message. The note was different. There was something urgent about the way it was written. And the more John stared at it, the more he felt that there was something he needed to understand. His fingers hovered over the paper for a moment, hesitant. He had a strong gut feeling that this was not an ordinary package. He couldn't ignore the note. His instincts told him to act quickly, but there was still uncertainty. John had been trained to deliver packages, not to get involved in situations like this. But the sense of urgency in the note was undeniable, and he knew he had to do something. As the reality of the moment sank in, John realized that his day, which had seemed like any other, was about to take an unexpected turn. John stood frozen for a moment, staring at the note attached to the package. His instincts told him there was something wrong, but he wasn't entirely sure what to do. He had delivered thousands of packages over the years, but this was different. The handwriting on the note was messy, hurried, almost as if someone had written it in a rush, needing to get the message out quickly. The words were short and to the point, yet they seemed to hold an underlying urgency that John couldn't shake. As he read the note again, his heart began to race, and his mind started racing with questions. The note read, "Please, help. It's an emergency. Call for help if you can." There was no name, no explanation, just a simple, yet chilling message. John looked around, trying to figure out where the note had come from, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. The house looked normal, just like any other in the neighborhood, but the note made it clear that something wasn't right. He glanced at the front door, half expecting someone to appear, but the house remained eerily still. John felt a strange tension building in the air, and it only grew stronger the longer he stood there. He carefully folded the note back and tucked it into his pocket. His mind raced as he considered what to do next. Should he just leave the package and move on with his deliveries? or should he take the note seriously and try to get help? John didn't hesitate for long. His gut told him that this was important. He couldn't just ignore the message, no matter how out of the ordinary it seemed. There was something about the urgency in those few words that made him feel like he had to act. John reached for his phone and quickly dialed his supervisor. His hands were shaking slightly as he spoke into the phone, trying to explain the situation as best he could. "Hey, there's a package here with a strange note attached to it. It says there's an emergency, and I'm not sure what to do about it. Should I call the authorities?" His voice was calm, but he couldn't hide the worry in his tone. His supervisor, on the other end, seemed a little confused at first, but after hearing the details, the urgency in his voice changed. "John, don't take any chances. Call the police and let them handle it. We don't know what's going on, and it's better to be safe than sorry." John quickly ended the call and immediately dialed the police. The uncertainty of the situation made him feel nervous, but he knew he was doing the right thing. His heart pounded in his chest as the phone rang. What had he just stumbled upon? What kind of emergency was going on inside that house? And why had the person left the note on the package instead of calling for help themselves? As the phone clicked and a voice on the other end answered, John could feel his pulse racing. He explained everything. The package, the note, and the strange feeling he had that something wasn't right. The operator on the other end was calm and reassuring, telling John to stay put and wait for the authorities to arrive. They would send someone right away. John's relief was immediate, but it was mixed with the unsettling feeling that he had just uncovered something he wasn't prepared for. He stood there for a few more moments, watching the house from the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of everything. Why hadn't anyone come out to collect the package? What kind of emergency could be happening inside that house? He had no answers, only questions, and an overwhelming sense that he was caught up in something much bigger than his usual deliveries. As John stood on the sidewalk, waiting for the police to arrive, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his chest. His mind kept returning to the note, the simple words that had conveyed such urgency. "Please, help. It's an emergency. Call for help if you can." They were just a few words, but they felt heavy, as if they carried a weight much greater than their appearance suggested. What had he gotten himself into? Was someone inside the house really in trouble, or had he misinterpreted the message? The minutes dragged on as John kept glancing at the house. Nothing seemed out of place. The blinds were drawn, and the front yard was neatly kept. No cars were parked in the driveway, and the whole area seemed quiet, almost too quiet. It was the calm before the storm, and John couldn't help but feel like something was about to break the silence. The note had come from this house, but the lack of any visible signs of distress made it hard for John to believe it. Could it be a false alarm? Could someone have written the note as a prank? But even as he considered that, he knew deep down that it didn't feel like a joke. His instincts told him this was real. John looked down at the package in his hands. The cardboard felt solid and heavy in his grip, and he couldn't help but wonder what was inside. Was it just an ordinary delivery that had been dropped off at the wrong house? Or was there more to it than that? There were no markings on the package, no return address or indication of its contents. Only the note, hastily written and desperately asking for help. His mind raced, but he kept coming back to the same thought. What if someone inside needed him? He looked back up the street to see if the police had arrived yet, but there was no sign of them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he quickly pulled it out, hoping for an update. It was a message from his supervisor, simply telling him to stay on the line with the authorities and to remain at the house until help arrived. John felt a mix of relief and frustration. He was just waiting. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Was he overreacting? Or was he possibly preventing something worse from happening? The minutes felt like hours, but eventually he saw the flashing lights of a police car turn onto the street. The sound of sirens filled the air, and John felt a sense of relief wash over him. Finally, someone else would take charge. He waved down the officer as they pulled up to the curb. The officer rolled down the window and looked at John, who quickly explained the situation. The officer's expression remained calm, but there was an underlying seriousness in his voice as he asked John to stay where he was. The officer stepped out of the car and approached the house with a measured pace. John stood there, watching the officer's every move. His heart raced, and his thoughts continued to race along with it. What was going on inside that house? Was there really an emergency? The waiting was the hardest part. John knew that the police were trained for this kind of thing, but still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary delivery. Soon, the officer knocked on the door, and John could hear the sound echoing down the street. There was a pause, then the door creaked open. John held his breath, hoping for some kind of answer, some indication that everything would be okay. But all he could do now was wait and hope that he had done the right thing. John stood at the edge of the driveway, his heart still pounding in his chest as the officer knocked on the door. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. He couldn't see what was happening inside the house, but he could hear faint sounds through the walls. The officer's steady, calm approach helped ease some of the tension, but John couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building up in his chest. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. He shifted from one foot to the other, his eyes never leaving the officer who was now speaking with someone behind the door. The officer nodded, listening intently, and John felt a flicker of hope that the situation was finally being addressed. But just as quickly as that hope appeared, it was replaced by confusion when the officer stepped back, looking toward the street with a furrowed brow. John took a few steps closer, instinctively wanting to be part of the solution. He wasn't sure what he expected to hear, but something in the officer's demeanor made it clear that the situation was still unclear. The officer waved him over, and John hurried to his side, his mind racing with questions. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice betraying the nerves he had been trying to suppress. The officer turned and motioned for John to follow him to the side of the house, away from any prying eyes. "We need to talk," he said in a low voice. "The situation's a bit more complicated than we first thought." John felt his stomach drop. What did that mean? He wondered. Had something happened inside that was worse than he could have imagined? Had he made a mistake in getting involved? The officer continued. "We found the person who wrote the note, but it's not what you think. We've got a person inside who's hurt, but they're not in any immediate danger. They've been trying to get help for days, and that's why the note was left on the package. But it's a delicate situation." John felt a wave of confusion. He had expected a clear, simple answer, but now, the more the officer spoke, the more questions seemed to arise. "What happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer glanced back toward the house before answering. "There was a medical emergency. The person inside has been dealing with a condition that makes it hard for them to reach out for help. They tried, but there were complications that delayed everything. We're taking care of it now. It's good you called it in when you did. It could have been worse." John nodded slowly, still processing what the officer had just told him. It wasn't the kind of emergency he had expected, but it was still serious. The note had been written in such a way that it had given him the impression of a life-or-death situation. But now he understood that it was more about getting the right kind of assistance to someone who couldn't do it themselves. "Is the person going to be okay?" John asked, his voice quieter now. The officer gave a reassuring nod. "Yes, they'll be fine. We're getting them the medical care they need. It's a good thing you didn't ignore the note. Who knows how long it might have been before someone noticed." John let out a deep breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A sense of relief washed over him, mixed with a lingering concern for the person inside the house. It wasn't the kind of resolution he had expected, but at least he knew the situation was in capable hands. He'd done what he could, and that was enough. As the officer prepared to go back inside, John took a step back, watching the scene unfold. He couldn't help but feel proud that he had trusted his instincts, even when everything seemed uncertain. It was a reminder that sometimes a small act, like noticing a note on a package, could lead to something bigger, something more important. And that small act had made all the difference. John stood by the edge of the house, watching the police officers go about their work. The earlier tension that had gripped him began to ease, though a sense of disbelief still lingered. The situation wasn't as dire as he had initially feared, but it wasn't exactly what he had expected either. He had imagined a dramatic rescue or a frantic rush to save someone in immediate danger. But now, standing there, he realized that this was more about a series of events that had led to a person being in trouble rather than a life-and-death emergency. The officer had explained that the individual inside had been in need of medical care for some time, but had been unable to reach out for help properly. The note had been a desperate attempt to get attention. John hadn't fully understood the complexities behind it at first, but as the officer spoke more about the situation, the details began to make sense. The person inside had been suffering from a medical condition that made it difficult for them to communicate or ask for assistance in the usual ways. They hadn't been able to make a phone call or contact anyone until the note was written. John reflected on the moment when he had first seen the note. It had been a simple message, a cry for help, but it had been so carefully written that it immediately felt important. He remembered how his heart had raced when he read it. The urgency in those few words had been enough to make him stop in his tracks and question everything. And now, as the officer explained the situation in more detail, John felt a deep sense of gratitude that he had acted on his instincts. The officer turned back toward John, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. "You did the right thing by calling us. We might have never known about this if you hadn't noticed the note," he said, his tone steady but grateful. "It was a close call. You saved someone from a lot of unnecessary pain." John felt a sense of pride swell within him, though he didn't want to make too much of it. After all, he was just doing his job. He had followed the procedure, made the call, and trusted his gut. But hearing the officer's words made him realize that his quick decision had truly made a difference. It wasn't every day that a routine delivery turned into a real-life rescue, and John couldn't help but feel humbled by the turn of events. As the officer walked back toward the house, John looked around, feeling the weight of the quiet neighborhood settling back in. The earlier tension was dissipating, but it wasn't completely gone. Even though the person inside was getting the help they needed, John couldn't shake the image of that note. The urgency, the feeling that someone had reached out in a moment of desperation, it was a stark reminder of how fragile life could be. He glanced back at the house, where the officers were now speaking to the person who had written the note. He could see the faint movements of people through the windows. They were taking care of things, making sure everything was handled properly. John felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his actions had been the catalyst for getting the help that was needed. As the minutes passed and the police wrapped up their work, John made his way back to his truck. The delivery he had been on had taken an unexpected turn, but now it was over. He felt a deep sense of relief, but also a renewed appreciation for the job he did every day. Sometimes, he realized, a small act of attention, something as simple as noticing a note on a package, could be the difference between a routine day and something far more significant. And for that, he was grateful. As John sat in his truck, the engine idling, he felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. The police had assured him that everything was under control, but his mind couldn't help but replay the events of the past hour. From the moment he had first seen the note on the package to the arrival of the authorities, it felt like a whirlwind of confusion and uncertainty. But now, everything had settled into a quiet calm, and John was left reflecting on the strange turn his day had taken. The officer had told him that the situation was being handled, and the person inside the house was now receiving the medical attention they needed. It wasn't the kind of emergency that John had imagined, but it was still serious. The note had been an urgent cry for help, and without it, the person inside might have continued to suffer in silence. John felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that he had acted in time. He had followed his instincts, something he'd learned to trust over the years, and it had paid off. In the end, the situation had been resolved, and the person would be okay. As he started driving again, John couldn't help but think about how strange life could be. One minute, he was simply delivering packages, doing his job, and the next, he found himself in the middle of an unexpected emergency. He had never thought of himself as a hero, and he wasn't one to seek recognition for doing his job. But today, something had been different. He had seen the need, recognized the urgency, and made the call that had led to help arriving just in time. The road in front of him stretched out, familiar yet somehow different now. It was still the same route he had driven for years, but today had changed him. John realized that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences. A single note on a package, something so simple, had been the key to saving someone's well-being. The thought made him pause for a moment, appreciating the way the smallest details in life could connect to something far bigger than he could have imagined. He passed the house again, the place where it had all started. It was quiet now, the police having finished their work. The house, once a place of uncertainty and tension, seemed peaceful again. It looked just like any other house in the neighborhood, but for John, it had become a symbol of how important it was to stay alert and aware. He knew that, in the end, it was his decision to pay attention to the note that had made all the difference. John continued on with his deliveries, but his thoughts were with the person inside that house. He hoped that they would recover quickly, and that no one would ever have to go through something like that again. But life wasn't always predictable, and John knew that he might one day find himself in another unexpected situation. And when that day came, he was ready to trust his instincts again, just as he had done today. As he drove further along his route, John couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but it was enough to remind him that sometimes the ordinary days could be the ones that made the most impact. The rest of John's day passed in a quiet blur. He continued with his deliveries, though his mind often drifted back to the house where he had first discovered the note. The whole experience had shaken him more than he had expected. He was just a USPS driver, a man who was used to following a routine, but today had shown him the importance of paying attention, of stepping outside of his usual role to do something more. He realized that in just a few moments, everything had changed, and the impact of that simple decision to call for help had reached far beyond what he could have imagined. As the afternoon wore on, John made his final delivery of the day. He pulled up to the last house on his route and parked the truck, but even as he walked up the driveway, he found it hard to fully focus. His thoughts were still on that moment when he had discovered the note and how a small action, just one phone call, had led to something so significant. He had been a small part of something much bigger, something that had changed a life. The weight of that realization had settled deep within him, and he couldn't help but feel a little more aware of the world around him. It wasn't until later that evening, after his shift had ended, that John had a chance to sit down and process everything that had happened. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat in his small apartment, reflecting on the day. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt still, and for once, he wasn't rushing to the next delivery or worrying about the time. He could finally breathe. As he sipped his coffee, John thought about the person he had helped today. He didn't know who they were or what had led to their need for assistance, but he hoped they were doing better now. The officer had assured him that everything was under control and that the person inside the house would be okay. But that reassurance didn't completely erase the nagging worry in the back of his mind. What if he hadn't noticed the note? What if he had simply carried on with his deliveries, assuming everything was fine? The thought made John uneasy, but at the same time, he knew he had done the right thing. He had trusted his instincts, followed through on his hunch, and called for help when it mattered most. Sometimes, he realized, doing the right thing wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about noticing the small things, those quiet details that other people might overlook. It was about taking action when the moment called for it, even if that action seemed small or insignificant in the grand scheme of things. John leaned back in his chair and let out a deep sigh, feeling a sense of pride in what he had done. It wasn't about the recognition, he thought. He wasn't expecting a medal or any kind of praise. But he did feel proud, in a quiet, humble way, for having made a difference. He had done his job, but he had also done something more, something that mattered. As he finished his coffee and got ready for bed, John felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The day had started like any other, with nothing out of the ordinary, but now, it would stay with him forever. It had reminded him of the power of small actions, the importance of paying attention to the world around him, and the difference one person could make when they chose to act. It wasn't the kind of day he could have planned for, but it was one he would always remember. The next morning, as John got ready for his shift, he couldn't help but replay the events of the previous day in his mind. It had been a quiet evening after his shift ended, but his thoughts had kept him awake longer than usual. He hadn't expected his work as a USPS driver to lead to something so meaningful, something so out of the ordinary. Yet, the feeling of uncertainty and relief still lingered. As he prepared his uniform and checked his phone for any updates from his supervisor, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was ready for whatever the day might bring, even if it was just another round of routine deliveries. The neighborhood had returned to its usual peaceful state. The house where the situation had unfolded was quiet now, the police having long since finished their work. John had been unsure about what to expect after everything had been handled, but as he passed the street, he saw the same familiar sights: the well-kept lawns, the morning joggers, the people on their way to work. It was like the events of the day before had faded into the past. But for John, it was a reminder that sometimes even the smallest actions could have the most profound effects. He couldn't stop thinking about the person inside that house, the one who had written the note and reached out for help in such a desperate way. John didn't know much about them, but he wondered how they were doing now. Were they recovering? Had they received the medical help they needed? The officer's words echoed in his mind. "It's a good thing you called. You saved someone from a lot of unnecessary pain." Those words had stuck with him. They had made him realize that what he had done mattered, even if it wasn't something heroic or dramatic. It was the simple act of noticing, of caring enough to take action. The day unfolded like any other. He made his deliveries, greeted familiar faces, and saw the same houses he had driven past countless times. But each stop held a new meaning for him now. He had been reminded of the importance of paying attention to the world around him, to the people who might need help in ways that weren't always obvious. John realized that it wasn't just about delivering packages. It was about being present, being aware, and responding when something didn't seem quite right. That day, he had done more than just complete his route. He had been a part of something that truly mattered. As the day came to an end, and John found himself back in his truck, heading home, he felt a quiet satisfaction. His routine hadn't changed, but he had. He wasn't the same driver he had been the day before. The experience had opened his eyes to the way small moments could lead to life-changing outcomes. It wasn't about seeking recognition or praise. It was about knowing, deep down, that he had done the right thing, and that his actions had made a difference. That night, as he lay in bed, John thought about the future. He knew that he would continue his work, day in and day out, but the lesson he had learned was one that would stay with him forever. Life wasn't just about the big events or dramatic moments. It was about noticing the little things, being there for others when they needed it most, and trusting yourself enough to take action. He had done that yesterday, and he would do it again, whenever the moment called for it. The simple act of noticing a note on a package had led to something bigger than he could have imagined. And in that quiet, unassuming way, John knew he had made a difference in the world. It was a small victory, but it was one that meant everything to him.